September 11th is a date that America has carved deeply into its own national conscience. Even if you weren't alive yet, you can be assured that you know exactly what this date represents and have felt the repercussions of it shaping life ever since. That's right. The Atari video computer system was released in North America. However, a slightly less well-known event around 30 years later was a plane hijacking and the subsequent crash into the Twin Towers. It probably goes without saying that 9/11 represents a radical shift in America, as the War on Terror was truly born and American security culture began on force. And amidst all of this, there was also a pretty noticeable shift in the media. I don't just mean that there was a dramatic increase of news coverage related to the Middle East, but that even entertainment television was impacted. Popular media occupies a pretty interesting space in how it acts as a reflection of the discourses being carried out by the public, while also giving a stage for the audience to participate in the central debate and form their own position through their response to the media. Yet, there's also a motive, not always intended consciously or maliciously, to not ostracize viewers. This means that the positions presented are usually a bit waffling and middle of the road, and any conclusion that the show comes to will generally be moderate or common sense enough that it won't receive much critique past some light grumbling. This becomes increasingly cyclic as TV presents only the most visible and middling positions while simultaneously being a central force behind determining what discourses and responses to the discourses are viewed by the large sectors of the public. Media representation also necessarily instructs the public on who the lurking presence that we should all be afraid of during such uncertain times is. The obvious answer of terrorist provided little comfort. Who were the terrorists? How could we protect ourselves from them? How could we recognize them before it was too late? So the answer shifted. Yes, you should be afraid of terrorists, but to be afraid of terrorists, you must also be afraid of anyone who you think looks Muslim. After all, though not all Muslims are terrorists, all terrorists are Muslims, so isn't wariness well justified? Contrary to what many people think, Muslims did actually exist prior to 2001. More than that, sometimes they even popped up in American cinema. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer before I get into the meat of things here. Because of how terrorist threats and Islamophobia have been approached in America, there's often a treatment of Arab and Muslim as synonymous. This isn't true, of course. There are many Arabs who aren't Muslim and many Muslims who aren't Arab. There's a further confusion that emerges since neither Iran nor Afghanistan are majority Arab countries. This said, because of the way discrimination has overlapped even when misdirected, much of what I'm discussing will apply to both groups. I do try and use the exact words I mean, but in order to not get bogged down in clarifying myself every single time, I'm just saying here at the top that when I mention Muslims or Arabs, I'm probably including both groups along with Muslim and Arab Americans. Okay, so with that hopefully cleared up, let's keep going. Dr. Jack Shaheen, who unfortunately passed away back in 2017, engaged in the absolutely Herculean effort of watching every single English language film that had an Arab or Muslim character show up in it, and he cataloged the trends he discovered. The book was published in 2001 and contained over 800 films, with an update edition several years later, bringing the number to total over 1,000. And, well, what he found wasn't great. Arab men were swarthy oil barons or violent scimitar-wielding barbarians. Arab women were highly sexualized objects for the white men in the films, or they were reduced to silent pack mules, toting jugs and baskets in the background. Maybe most remarkable from these caricatures is how constant they were across 100 years of film history. Now, you may have noticed that publication date, and yeah, talk about inconvenient timing. I actually read the foreword to the updated edition in 2012, and Shaheen doesn't comment on 9/11, which is fair enough. He has other works that engage with it in depth, and this history is still worth engaging with in its own context. But I do still feel that it's a bit unfortunate and definitely ironic. So here we are. It's 2012. We're all wondering if sticking to the workout plan actually matters since the Mayan calendar supposedly says we're all gonna kick it before the year's out. And Evelyn Alsultany, Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, is like, hey, I wonder how media representation has changed since 2001. And she puts forth the radical notion that maybe 9/11 and the escalation of the War on Terror had some impact on our media landscape. Her work focuses primarily on television rather than film, but in many ways does act as a spiritual successor to Shaheen's work. Alsultany sets out to start watching and analyzing this new decade of media, ready to see a whole new generation of belly dancers and oil sheiks with probably a much larger sprinkling of terrorists. And that's not what she finds. Don't get it wrong, there was a huge influx of media vilifying Arabs and Muslims, but there was also a not insignificant amount that seemed to want to combat this and instead champion Muslims and Muslim Americans. So, how successful were they? Well, there were definitely attempts. Okay, I'm being a bit harsh, but yeah, not exactly what would be heralded as excellent representation. But in a media landscape that you only needed to turn around a bit too fast to bump into another terrorist for the white American heroes to defeat, these efforts were good. That's that's my radical thesis, saying that not every Muslim is a terrorist is a good thing. So, if not villains, who are these characters? We get what Alsultany coined simplified complex representations. This means generally that the characters were an effort to inject nuance into the broader discourse and show Muslims breaking from the mold that news media was constructing, while ultimately still presenting flat characters that didn't really exist in their own right, but instead only to teach a lesson to others. These simplified complex representations come to coalesce into this idea of a good patriotic Muslim, which, well, it sounds great at first glance. Yeah, Muslims can be patriotic, because they can be Americans like everyone else. And, well, shouldn't we think it's really cool that we've made a country that so many different groups can feel patriotism towards? But instead, the actual good patriotic Muslim implies the opposite. See, it presupposes a definition of America that's inherently exclusionary toward Muslims. Well, it's not impossible for a Muslim to be American, it's assumed that they aren't until they can prove otherwise, and they have to continue proving it or else they have their American card revoked. Further, good and American within this framework get constructed as synonymous. The good Muslim has to have unwavering allegiance to the US. They have to be a patriot above all else, so much so that it overrides any other personal identification they might have. Even stretching to the extreme, a good Muslim should be willing to give up their rights as a citizen if it means giving peace of mind to the other, real Americans. And if they don't, then they're actually a bad Muslim. What often comes out of this is a depiction of Muslim Americans as either a civilian or a government agent who's working with the state to combat terrorism. They can prove in this way that being a Muslim doesn't necessarily make them un-American, not like those bad Muslims who want to undermine and destroy America. This brings us to the superhero. After all, what could be more American than the superhero? There actually are a number of Muslim and Muslim American heroes, but that number decreases pretty drastically when we narrow the scope to non-background characters who were actually made by Muslims. The one that most people will likely be familiar with is Miss Marvel, also known as Kamala Khan. Kamala is a 16-year-old Muslim American girl living in, New Jersey? What? New Jersey? New Jersey? That, that doesn't sound like a real place. Okay, well, Kamala is from the definitely not made up place of New Jersey, being born to Pakistani parents, making her a first generation American. Her initial appearance actually comes from a cameo she had in a Captain Marvel comic in 2013, but she gets her own run a few months later in 2014. Her superhero kicks off after she goes to a party and has an encounter with Terrigen Mist. As a result of this encounter, she gains the power of morphogenesis, essentially really extreme shapeshifting, and finds herself thrust into the world of heroics when she uncovers a conspiracy to kidnap teenagers and use them as human batteries. Kamala is the brainchild of Sana Amanat and G. Willow Wilson, who themselves are both Muslim women from New Jersey. And sorry for the earlier jab. I have family from New York, so I'm legally obligated to make fun of New Jersey at least once whenever it comes up in conversation. Kamala's debut was celebrated by a lot of people since she was the first main Muslim superhero. It actually kicked off a whole trend of people holding the comic up to their own faces to cover the lower half of their face with Kamala's. And this trend was overall a pretty cool expression of the positive nature of representation and visibility. But, well, Kamala wasn't really intended as representation, especially not representation as politics. When asked about this in 2017, Amanat responded, "People have been using Miss Marvel as a political statement. I do not necessarily want her to be one. Like all of our superheroes, Miss Marvel has to be a unifier." You know, I don't think that this is a bad sentiment. It isn't great to have this expectation thrust on characters that because they're a part of a minority, that their existence is then somehow inherently political. That said, Kamala is inherently a political statement, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. At present, we live in a society that has a very rigid definition of what's normal, and those who deviate in any aspect from this normality often find themselves disenfranchised and excluded from being part of the core structure of their communities. And what is normal? Ranging from media to those who hold positions of power, we're told that normal is white, Christian, cishet, able-bodied, neurotypical men. And can I just say here, wow, that's a lot of labels. I mean, I could understand maybe one or two of those, but all of them in one person? I don't know, that just seems pretty unrealistic to me. But because this normality gets perpetuated through existing power structures and through who gets afforded visibility, any assertion of the existence of people who fall into minority categories or, God forbid, have stories about them that don't revolve around white men is made to be political because it challenges and destabilizes these power structures. Through this definition of normative existence, the inclusion of minority groups is not inherent and, in fact, is made to be aberrant. This means that for identities like that of being American, people who don't conform to the prescribed normativity, especially when it comes to race, ethnicity, and religion, find their identity as an American on shaky ground. Rather than it being a given on account of place of birth and citizenship, many Americans, including ones who come from several generations of Americans, find their nationality questioned. Even among people who are well-meaning, there can still exist this unconscious bias of seeing themselves as the default, while everyone different from them exists as an outsider who's allowed to exist in the same society, but not necessarily be a part of it. In one of the many TV courtroom dramas that sought to address the Muslim question post 9/11, a lawyer is hired to challenge the constitutionality of an airline refusing to allow Muslims on board. Though dramatized for the purpose of entertainment, this was an issue that many Muslims and people perceived to be Muslims experienced, frequently being forced off planes because they made the other passengers nervous. When the lawyer appeals for the judge to recognize the unconstitutionality of such a provision, the language he uses enforces an exclusion where Muslim and Arab Americans are removed from American experience. He employs an us versus them dichotomy and speaks on how they blew up the World Trade Center, but we need to think about who we are as people and whether or not we stand for equal rights. And although they violated us, we cannot in turn violate our freedom. This suddenly shifts the conversation. It's no longer about that Muslim Americans, just as any citizen, are entitled to the preservation of their rights. Instead, it's about whether this imagined American populace is willing to eschew the rights of others in exchange for feeling a bit more secure. The government isn't acting against us, but against an ambiguous them. As Alsultany explains, the bodies of these groups are reinscribed as outside of American citizenship through an appeal to real Americans not to be racist because greater moral principles are at stake. The implicit exclusion demands that minority groups perform Americanness in order to prove themselves as American. Similarly, for Kamala to be accepted as a superhero, there has to be an elimination of the cognitive dissonance present between Kamala as a Muslim Pakistani girl, while a superhero has to be a white American man. Several recent superheroes of color have made themselves more easily accepted within the canon by being framed as a continuation of an existing beloved hero. Sam Wilson continues on Captain America, Miles Morales is another in the established line of Spider-Man, and Riri Williams is a de facto stand-in for Iron Man. Even Kamala herself does this to an extent, taking up the mantle of the former Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers. This appeal to an established canon is only one part of firmly asserting Kamala as belonging within these stories. Namely, Kamala is made to ooze heroism from her very pores. Her blood cells, when looked at under a microscope, are wearing spandex and miniature capes. When she sneezes, a colorful speech bubble with the sound effect appears above her head. Even Superman cited her as his inspiration for becoming a superhero and helping others. Okay, well, maybe not quite that extent. But when we look at Kamala's character, she is easily identifiable as a relatable, awkward teenager. She gets into fights with her parents, has to deal with popular cliques and math tests at school, worries about the world's future as climate change continues to not be adequately addressed, and deals with crushes on boys. On top of that, Kamala also is constructed in parallel to the idea of the prototypical superhero. She possesses a strong morality and equally strong sense of justice. She's determined to avoid hurting people and animals alike, and other characters in a universe go so far as to comment on her righteous outlook and behavior. Through her heroism, we also frequently see her showing respect for authority, with that respect manifesting as a support for existing power structures. But, well, why exactly are these attributes in particular core components of a prototypical hero? More than that, where did our idea of a prototypical hero even come from? The answer to both these questions is found in the Silver Age of comics. To understand what exactly the Silver Age was, we need to step back in time and look at the history of comics themselves. So there are 4 ages, and yes, I'm saying 4 for simplicity's sake, because there are, of course, other ages that some people think should be inserted between the main 4, and some people argue that our current age of comics has finished and we're starting a new age now. And it's certainly all interesting. After all, who doesn't love getting extremely passionate and arguing over niche topics? But it's also fairly irrelevant to what we're discussing here. So all you need to know is that not everyone agrees with the exact definitions of the different ages of comics. So, like I said, simplicity. There are 4 ages: gold, silver, bronze, and modern. For what I hope should be obvious reasons, we're currently in the modern age. Even though the Silver Age started around the mid-1950s and lasted through the 70s, making it about 50 years old at this point, it's the Silver Age that has continued to define what it is to be a superhero in the public conscious up to our modern day. Admittedly, this has been mitigated somewhat by the massive popularity of Marvel's cinematic universe. But in the ancient times of 2014, when Miss Marvel was released, the first Avengers film had only just come out, and while certainly popular, didn't yet have as much of a stranglehold on the media landscape as it would eventually come to have. Where the Golden Age had comics on a wide range of topics and genres, the Silver Age really became defined by the superhero comic. A lot of our most iconic superheroes come from this period, like Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, Hulk, and Professor X. Notice that prior to Robert Downey Jr.'s debut as Iron Man, it was these characters who were getting adapted into films. Above all, the Silver Age is really defined by its strict conformity and perpetuation of a sense of stability and moral righteousness. That vision we have of superheroes always doing what's right, always triumphing over evil, and acting in line with the intent of the state and status quo? Yep, all from the Silver Age. But how did this come about? Did all the comic artists just wake up one day with an all-consuming desire to draw weirdly buff men in spandex for the next 2 decades? Well, I can't prove that they didn't, but the more probable contributor in this shift was the Comics Code Authority. Many parents and members of government began expressing concerns surrounding comic content, fearing that the depictions of things like graphic violence, drug use, and sex was giving rise to juvenile delinquency. To combat these fears that their children would grow up to be too cool, the Comics Code Authority, or CCA, was introduced in 1954 to regulate what could and could not be depicted in comics. It wasn't technically legally enforced, but it became ubiquitous enough that people wouldn't buy a comic unless it had the CCA's seal on it. Recognizing that if they wanted to sell any of their comics, they would have to get that seal, the comics industry began self-censoring. And actually, large comic publishers like DC wouldn't even officially stop working with the CCA until 2011. The guidelines introduced by the CCA were fairly stringent and at times seemingly a little bizarre. Among the rules were prohibitions to things you may have expected, like sex and drug use, but more inane things like werewolves were also banned. Above all, however, the rules emphasized the unquestionable role of the state and an assertion of a singular and total moral code. So, from this came rules like policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds, and inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. With such strict guidelines, many publishers turned their sights to the superhero comic, which offered a pretty easy template for still writing fun, action-packed stories, while avoiding anything the moral outrage machine may have found too objectionable. With such a standardized model of how to make a superhero, it's probably no wonder that this is how the idea of the superhero got grounded in American culture. But, well, ultimately this code was a product of its time, and its time, you might be surprised to learn, wasn't super gung-ho about the whole advocating for minority rights thing. The prototype of the superhero is still fundamentally grounded in the expectation that the character is a white man. So a lot of behaviors that aren't questioned when it's a white man doing it are suddenly highlighted as an incongruity when anyone else is slotted into that role, without also fundamentally reshaping the surrounding narrative structures. Consider the exclusion and discrimination that Muslims experience. There's a desire in Kamala's story to acknowledge this, given that it's unfortunately instrumental in how many Muslims experience and interact with American society. But the endemic nature of the issue can't be acknowledged without bringing into question her allegiance to the status quo and its existing hierarchical power structures. Because of this, the Islamophobia that is represented in the story gets boiled down to some rude words directed at Kamala and her friend Nakia by a popular girl. Suddenly, discrimination can't exist at a societal level, but is instead representative only of individual shortcoming and subsequently easy to dismiss in the face of the much greater threats Kamala faces in her day-to-day superheroing. There is a brief acknowledgement of the state's role in perpetuating violence against Muslims. Where other superheroes maintain their secret identities to prevent supervillains from targeting their families and friends, Kamala identifies not supervillains as a central motive for her hiding her inhuman status, but rather the government. She quips that if her identity is discovered, quote, the NSA will wiretap our mosque or something. Ultimately, this is only expressed as a joke to display Kamala's tendency toward hyperbole in spite of government surveillance of Muslims being a very real problem. Following 9/11, the Justice Department wanted to conduct interviews with young Arab and Muslim immigrant men who were suspected as potentially having information on terrorism. These interviews were carried out without actually charging the men with anything and without providing them an attorney. Many of the men who got caught up in this feared that if they weren't seen as compliant, then their patriotism would be called into question and their citizenship jeopardized, which could result in turn with detention or deportation. Over the course of just a few weeks, the government rounded up and detained over 1,000 men. This is to say nothing of the continuous invasions of privacy the government has carried out, as well as the previous administration essentially trying to ban Muslims from even visiting the country. All in all, Kamala would be well within her right to express distrust of government authorities. But even if we take her statement about her mosque being wiretapped as a legitimate concern rather than as a joke, this distrust ultimately gets undermined through the celebratory way the police are presented. Throughout her initial character arc, Kamala struggles with accepting help from others because she feels that her newly acquired powers make it her responsibility to help everyone else. This character arc reaches its conclusion when she's facing off against the villainous inventor and finds herself losing badly. At last, she realizes that she can't do everything by herself, and she can allow herself to rely on others. She calls for help. Who should answer this call and arrive with a bright, halo-esque light shining behind them? The police. This choice within the narrative doesn't only frame the police as being heroic and good through their alignment with Kamala, but it also specifically ties Kamala's arc to the idea not just that she can rely on other people, but that she should rely on and trust the police. From this point on, she works with the cops several more times, and we're meant to understand them not as the strong arm of the government perpetuating violence and systematic discrimination, but instead as a unilateral and triumphant good that aids our heroes in keeping evil at bay. This absolute loyalty and support of the state that Kamala embodies as a continuation of the Silver Age, you've probably noticed, also has strong parallels to the idea of the good patriotic Muslim, as we talked about earlier. Kamala is proving her heroism through her alignment with the state, and implicitly confirming that heroism, here a stand-in for being American, is something that is proven rather than innate. Remember how the good Muslim was often framed as proving their goodness through their opposition to the bad Muslims? Well, after the defeat of the inventor, she begins a new arc where the primary antagonist is a terrorist organization that wants to wipe out humans in order to make room for a new generation of mutants. There's two issues with this conflict. The first is one that we see with many superheroes, that being the preservation of the status quo. The grievances mutants have are legitimate, even while their reaction to their grievances are less so. The confrontation ultimately revolves around defeating the organization, so when the end of the arc is reached through their defeat, the actual conflict that was motivating these actions never gets addressed. But, like I said, that's not exactly unique to this story. The other issue comes back to this good versus bad Muslim construction. Though two of the three named members of the organization are white or white passing, the story focuses on the third and only non-white member, Kamran, a Muslim American boy and an initial love interest for Kamala. Even though from a strictly narrative standpoint, Kamran is only a lackey within the organization, the framing presented makes him the main embodiment of the terrorists. This fundamentally reshapes Kamala's battle against the organization to not be her against a faceless group of angry mutants, but instead Kamala as the good Muslim versus Kamran as the bad Muslim. In having these story beats that replicate the broader media's development of the patriotic Muslim archetype, Miss Marvel takes part in advancing the narratives of Muslims being removed from American identity, with patriotism being something proven only through deference to state authority. This circles back to what I had said earlier about how the comic wants to address Islamophobia, but has to do so in a way that doesn't cite any form of systematic or state-sanctioned discrimination. Yet, in denying the existence of structures that perpetuate this discrimination, then it can only be addressed at an individual level and is pardoned from having any broader impacts on the lives of Muslims. This is part of what can be understood broadly as an adoption and subsequent diffusion of the discourse of multiculturalism. Media will depict a multicultural society like by having a black and a white cop work together to stop crimes, or by having a Muslim woman working for the CIA. But it won't address the continued existence of the structural inequalities that prevent or discourage this from happening outside of fiction. Because of this, it ends up reaffirming an understanding of reality that shifts the blame for inequality onto those subject to it. If there aren't structural inequalities, then criminals aren't criminals because of their circumstances, but because criminals have to be bad people. A neoliberal approach to inequality gets constructed through media's appropriation of multiculturalism. All power is shifted to the individual, with a parallel inability or a refusal to redress any of the circumstances that have led or contributed to the current point. We can't work toward an elimination or deinstitutionalization of Islamophobia, but can only seek to personally escape from it. The individual can become exempt from discrimination through their personal integration into the very structures that have constructed and perpetuated the inequality. Alsultany explains this really well. She tells us, within this new racial formation, racism constantly appears as disappearing according to conventional race categories, even as it takes on new forms that can signify as non-racial or even anti-racist. These new anti-racist forms are aptly apparent when Guantanamo Bay prisoners are provided with copies of the Quran and time to pray as evidence of the cultural sensitivity of their captors, or when the USA Patriot Act contains a section that condemns discrimination against Arab and Muslim Americans. Such gestures attempt to subvert the focus from the violation of civil and human rights in favor of highlighting multiculturalism and racial sensitivity. Another insidious implication lying beneath the surface here is that it's suddenly the fault of the individual that they're subject to discrimination. After all, if there's a clear route out by buying into these systems, then anyone who doesn't is essentially expressing their willingness to be discriminated against. This is, of course, overlooking 1. That discrimination does still exist within the systems, 2. Not everyone wants to work in such a position, and they shouldn't be punished for that, and 3. To be integrated into the system demands that there always remain those outside of and subject to it. If we were to accept this, it would ask us to similarly accept that there must always be discrimination, just so a lucky few can be exempt from it. Despite these critiques I've offered of Kamala's character, I don't intend this to be taken as me saying that she's bad or problematic representation. Many of the traits that I have picked out as playing into upholding ideas of the good patriotic Muslim and the exclusion of Muslims from an American identity aren't unique to Kamala, but are standard components of this genre. Things like teaming up with the police and deferring to their authority is ubiquitous. Just consider superheroes like Spider-Man. In spite of being classified as public menace number 1 and an illegal vigilante, he still wraps up all his villains and leaves them ultimately for the police to arrest, trusting that the legal system will carry out proper justice rather than taking any sort of retributive justice into his own hands. And, well, of course we see Kamala's traits reduplicated across the genre. The reason why she even has these traits is because they're the prototype of what it is to be a superhero. This doesn't excuse the issues I've pointed out, but it also doesn't allow us to be as reductive as Miss Marvel bad. Since these are traits shared by the majority of mainstream superherodom, to demand that she not conform to them could even risk increasing a degree of ostracization, where her being a Muslim is taken as preventing her from being a conventional superhero. Kamala definitely highlights the issue of superheroes' commitment to the status quo through the more overt incongruity present between her identity and her patriotic loyalties. But these issues have been present ever since the Red Scare and the institutionalization of the Comics Code Authority. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to demand that Kamala alone should be changed rather than leveling criticism at the genre as a whole. But considering that the US military has started funding Marvel movies again, we probably aren't going to be seeing a massive genre shift anytime soon. Even where I personally feel like Kamala plays into some troubling character standards, in many regards, she's also a great opportunity for people to see themselves represented and celebrated. Jack Shaheen had reflected, "It must be trying for young Arab Americans to openly express pride in their heritage when they realize that their peers know only Hollywood's real Arabs, billionaires, bombers, and belly dancers, which is to say, they don't know real Arabs at all." So while Kamala, along with the proliferation of Muslim government agents and patriots the Alsultany studied, are certainly still flawed, it does display progress in shifting the established narratives and trying to present Muslims in a new, more positive light, rather than framing them as unilaterally villainous. Kamala, and hopefully many more characters to come, offer mainstream, on-screen figures that Muslim youth can be proud of, see themselves reflected in, and cite as inspirations. What we can see here isn't that Kamala is problematic representation, but that this idea of representation itself is the central problem. In short, representation needs to be done away with and rejected, not in a way that there should be no minorities in our media, but rather that the presence of minorities becomes so common that no individual character is expected to represent the enormous entirety of a population. At present, there's so few characters like Kamala that she has no choice but to be representative of all Pakistani Muslim girls. For many readers, they may not even know any Pakistanis or Muslims in real life, so their only exposures come through how they're represented in media. And, well, if there's only one character like you in the media, there's not a lot of space to get to know people as diverse individuals rather than as a bundle of inescapable characteristics. Rather than nitpicking or critiquing individual characters and their storylines, we should really work toward flooding media with so much diversity that no single character has to shoulder the burden of representing an entire demographic of doubtlessly highly diverse people. Now, I could just end it here. I could tell you that representation as a concept is bad because we need to introduce a media landscape that doesn't commodify identity and therefore doesn't have any singular character that has to be representative of anything. And, that wouldn't be a bad conclusion. It hopefully offers a perspective that you haven't considered before, maybe prompts some reflection or conversations in the future. Hey, there's even a little bit of a call to action underlining it. Go out and create, tell stories of people who don't get their stories told. Be a part of making the media we consume as diverse and interesting as the people that make the societies the media is supposed to be about. But it just didn't feel right to end it here. I kept thinking about this one quote from Shaheen. When was the last time you saw a movie depicting an Arab or an American of Arab heritage as a regular guy? Perhaps a man who works 10 hours a day, comes home to his loving wife and family, plays soccer with his kids, and prays with family members at his respective mosque or church. He's the kind of guy you'd like to have as your next-door neighbor. Because, well, maybe because he's a bit like you. Shaheen isn't wrong, of course. This entire past century of depictions has displaced the everyday ordinary lives of Muslims with an imagined foreign landscape of Agrabah that's populated entirely by oil sheiks and their harems. But I want to focus on that last line, that the Muslim or Arab or Muslim American is welcome as a neighbor because he's like you. We see this replicated with Kamala, that, above all, she's just a teenage girl from New Jersey. Yeah, she keeps halal, but she still thinks bacon smells really good. She's a huge fan of comics and superheroes. Isn't that so relatable? Doesn't it make her differences more palatable, that after scraping away her otherness, we can see that she really is just an average American like everyone else? In this effort to make her still relatable to normative society, it's confirming what we were shown with the good patriotic Muslim. Kamala is not American simply by virtue of having been born and raised here, but she's allowed to be understood as American when she's seen to fit well enough into that American mold. But what about the Muslim girl who isn't relatable? Maybe she wears a niqab and does salat. She doesn't speak a word of English and has no desire to learn it. She isn't knowledgeable about modern pop culture, she hasn't attended a public high school with other kids her age, and she thinks that Star Wars is better than Star Trek. If she was still born in an American hospital, do any of these things make her less American? And if they do, why? What standard of being American have we developed, and who is it modeled on? We've been heralded as the great American melting pot, that everyone who crosses the shining seas to make a new life here becomes just as much a part of the country as their neighbor beside them. But this melting pot really only goes one way. Yeah, you can be an American, but only if you melt yourself down and fit yourself into the shape that others ask of you. Why does our compassion have to be predicated on similarities and recognition of ourselves and others? There are people who I'll never know, who will live their lives in ways that I just can't comprehend, who have ways of thinking about the world that will always remain elusive to me. But that doesn't negate their humanity. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't reach out with compassion and support. There are millions of people in this world that exist in ways totally foreign to me. And I think that's pretty cool. I think we should get excited by differences, strangeness, things unknown. And when I do meet someone I don't understand, well, that's suddenly an entirely new world that I get to learn about. Thank you for listening all the way through. Wow, this kinda got away from me. Definitely did not mean for it to get this long, but I find this to be a really interesting topic. I've actually written about it before in a relatively more abbreviated form, so it's cool to revisit it now and refine and expand on my ideas. Hey, what do you call an apprentice orthographer in a mushroom court? A like and subscribe. Follow me for more excellent analysis and even better puns. Or leave a comment expressing your deep hatred for my puns. I'll ignore you, of course, but it'll help boost the video's engagement. If you're interested in learning more about any of these subjects, I've included all my sources in the description below. There's also a link to a TED Talk Evelyn Alsultany gave that I would really recommend checking out in case you don't feel like reading through the more academic texts. Well, don't let anyone convince you that New Jersey is a real place, and I'll see you in the next video.